She wasn't beautiful in the way people usually praised her. Not slender, not gentle, not silent in the face of criticism. The whole valley mocked her every morning. The fat woman wading through the mud to gather weeds while their crops were dying. Then one day, insects swarmed in. In a week, every field in Red Willow Valley was wiped out. The men proudly looked at their empty granaries and realized that the woman they had once mocked was the only one who knew how to feed them. Like and comment the name of the city you're viewing. I want to know how far this story has gone. The morning Maeve Callahan turned 26. She woke before dawn the same way she always did. Not because anyone expected her to, but because the hour before sunrise was the only part of the day that felt entirely her own. She dressed quietly in the dark, pulling on her worn canvas boots without lighting a lamp. Gideon was still asleep, turned toward the wall with one arm folded under his head, his breathing slow and even. She watched him for a moment from the doorway. He was a decent man. She believed that sincerely, but decent didn't always mean understanding, and she'd long since stopped confusing the two. Outside, the air smelled like creek water and pine resin, and the particular sharpness of dew on dry grass. Red Willow Valley in late summer had a beauty that most of its settlers were too tired to notice. The mountains to the north caught the first color of morning before anything else. A pale amber that deepened slowly, the way a bruise changes color in reverse. Maeve noticed it every day. She noticed most things people didn't. She followed the footpath down from the cabin toward the lower creek without a lantern. She didn't need one. She'd walked this stretch of ground so many times that her feet knew where the roots crossed the path and where the soft bank dipped toward the water. She carried 2 baskets, one wide and shallow, one deep and narrow, and a small folding knife she kept sharper than her husband's pocket knife by a considerable margin. The creek ran low this late in the season, its voice quieter than spring, almost contemplative. Maeve crouched at the edge where the bank flattened out and studied the growth along the waterline. Watercress in the shallows, dense and dark-leaved. Sheep sorrel on the dry bank above it, the small, red-tipped leaves unmistakable once you knew what to look for. Lamb's quarters farther up the slope, already seeding out at the tops but still tender at the base. She worked steadily and without hurry, cutting close to the root and leaving enough behind to grow back. She'd been doing this for 3 years, since the second winter after she and Gideon arrived in the valley, when their food stores ran short in February, and she'd remembered something her grandmother used to say. The land doesn't stop giving, people just stop asking. Her grandmother had been a hard, practical woman from the eastern mountains, and she'd taught Maeve the names of things before she'd taught her to read. Maeve had never forgotten either lesson. She filled the shallow basket with greens and moved upstream, crouching under a stand of alders to check the ground beneath. Wood violets, the leaves edible and slightly sweet, stinging nettles along the north-facing bank. Unpleasant to touch, but remarkable cooked, better than most cultivated greens in terms of what they put into a body. She used a piece of folded cloth to handle them, pinching the stems low. By the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge and threw proper light across the valley floor, she had both baskets reasonably full and was following the creek back toward the main settlement trail. That was when she heard them. 3 women, walking the upper road with market baskets of their own. She recognized their voices before she saw their faces. Beatrice Crowell's carrying the farthest, as it always did, high and bright and pointed as a tack. Saw her again this morning, down by the lower creek. Both baskets, same as every day. A second voice, softer but not disagreeing. What does she find down there, honestly? Mud and sticks? Laughter. Light, easy laughter. The kind that doesn't require cruelty to sound cruel. Gideon must be mortified, Beatrice said. His wife out at dawn picking weeds like a goat, while every other woman in this valley is putting up proper preserves. Maeve stopped walking. She wasn't hidden. She was 20 feet off the trail, visible if any of them looked, but none of them did. She stood there with a basket in each hand and let the words wash over her the way creek water washes over a stone. Not harmless, but familiar. She had a choice, the same one she made most mornings. She could step onto the trail and let them see her, watch their faces shift into the particular combination of embarrassment and defiance that people wore when they'd been caught saying what they actually thought. Or she could wait until they passed. She waited. It wasn't cowardice. She'd asked herself that question enough times to be honest about the answer. It was something closer to conservation, of energy, of dignity. of the patience she'd need for the rest of the day. Fighting Beatrice Crowell was like trying to bail out a river. You could do it until your arms gave out and the river wouldn't notice. She walked home along the lower path instead, taking the longer route that avoided the main road. Gideon was up when she got back, standing at the stove with a tin cup of coffee and the look on his face that meant he hadn't slept as well as he'd seemed. He was a tall man, lean in the way that outdoor work made men lean, with hands that were permanently rough no matter how often he worked grease into them. He looked at her baskets the way he always did. Not unkindly, exactly, but with a particular restraint, like a man carefully not saying something. "Anything good?" he asked. "Nettles, watercress, some lamb's quarters." He nodded slowly. "Margaret Holt was by yesterday while you were at the lower fields. She asked if you were coming to the women's canning session Thursday. I wasn't invited to the women's canning session. She said it was an open invitation." Maeve set her baskets on the work table and began sorting through the greens, shaking the damp ones loose to let them breathe. "Margaret Holt has never given me an open invitation to anything. She's hoping I'll bring preserves and contribute to the table so she can feel generous without having spent anything." Gideon didn't respond immediately. That was another of his habits, the long pause before the careful sentence. "It might do you good to go," he said finally. "Be among people." "I'm among people plenty. I mean, the women of this valley, the ones you'd have to live next to." She looked up at him. He met her eyes for a moment, then looked back at his coffee. "You mean the ones who laugh at me?" "Maeve, I'm not wrong and you know it." She said it without heat, without tears. Just the flat fact of it. "I hear what gets said. You probably do too." He didn't deny it. That, at least, she respected about him. Gideon Mercer wasn't a man who lied outright. He just sometimes chose very particular silences. "It would go easier," he said, "if you fit in a little more." She thought about the watercress in her basket and the nettles still damp from the creek. She thought about the way the bird calls had changed over the past 2 weeks. Not vanished exactly, but thinned. The creek frogs she'd counted every spring since their second year here. She hadn't heard any for the past 3 mornings. She thought about the small brown beetles she'd seen along the south-facing fields last week, moving in columns so organized they looked almost intentional. "I'll think about Thursday," she said. She didn't go to Thursday's canning session, but she spent that morning walking the upper fields along the tree line, watching the ground. The beetles came on a Tuesday. Not slowly. Not the gradual way that pests usually arrived, creeping into awareness over days until someone finally admitted the problem was serious. This was different. This was the kind of arrival that people would describe afterward using words like wall and wave and out of nowhere, as though nature had made a decision and acted on it all at once. Maeve was at the creek when it started. She heard the sound before she understood what it was, a low, papery rustling that grew louder as she stood up from the bank. The kind of sound that shouldn't exist outdoors at that time of morning. She turned toward the south field and stood very still. The beetles were moving across the upper slope of the valley in a front so dense it actually changed the color of the ground, dark brown shifting to darker brown, a living tide that moved with horrible steadiness toward the nearest rows of planted corn. She watched them reach the first stalks. She watched the stalks disappear. She ran. Not toward the fields. There was nothing she could do about the fields. She ran back to the cabin, grabbed 2 empty sacks and her largest basket, and went back to the creek. Moving fast now, no longer the quiet, contemplative pace of an ordinary morning. She filled the basket with watercress. She pulled lamb's quarters by the root and shook them clean and pushed them into a sack. She moved upstream to the nettle stand and stripped it without the cloth, because there wasn't time, letting the sting work across her palms and forearms without stopping. She knew where the patches of sheep sorrel spread across the dry hillside to the east. She found 3 patches of wood violets she'd been watching for 2 weeks that had come in thick and strong. She worked for 4 hours without stopping. When she finally came back to the cabin, her arms were welted from the nettles and her boots were soaked through and both sacks were full. She sat down on the porch step and put her face in her hands for a moment, not crying, just breathing. The Southfield corn was gone. She'd heard the shouting from the neighboring farms even at the creek. She could still hear it now, faint across the valley. By afternoon, the scope of it was becoming clear. The Holts had lost their corn and most of their bean rows. The Pruitts, on the north slope, had thought at first they'd been spared. The beetles seemed to avoid higher ground. But by midday, the front had shifted and swept through their potato beds in under 2 hours. Old Man Garrett, whose farm was the largest in the valley, and the one everyone used as a kind of informal weather vane for the settlement's overall health, came out of his south field at noon with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that Maeve had never seen before. Not anger, something worse than anger. The hollow, slightly stunned expression of a man who has just understood that the problem is real. People gathered the way they always gathered in a crisis, at Garrett's fence, which was the widest flat area near the center of the valley. Maeve walked down with Gideon, who hadn't said much since coming in from checking their own small corn patch. The patch was gone. Gideon had planted it himself in early May, and had been quietly proud of how the rows had come in straight and even. Now there was nothing there but stripped stalks. He stood at the fence with the other men and stared at nothing while they talked. Maeve stood slightly apart, the way she usually stood in crowd situations, and listened. "Whole south field," Tom Holt was saying. He was a red-faced man with forearms like birch logs, and the disbelief in his voice was almost painful to hear. 40 acres, 3 days' worth of harvest, gone in a morning. "We still have the root cellar stores," said Pruitt. "Root cellar stores don't carry a family past February, not if winter comes hard." This from Elias Garrett, who knew his arithmetic and wasn't the type to comfort people with math that didn't add up. "We can send to Harlan County for supplies. On what credit? Half the valley's got dead enough already." Beatrice Crowell was there too, standing with a group of women near the fence post. She'd been crying. Her eyes were red, and she kept pressing a handkerchief to them with a dignity that looked practiced. Her kitchen garden had been destroyed. She'd grown the best kitchen garden in the valley, by general agreement, and she'd been rightfully proud of it. Maeve did not feel satisfaction about this. She didn't feel much of anything about Beatrice Crowell's kitchen garden except a distant, practical sadness that good food was gone. She looked at the women beside Beatrice and thought about what they had left. Most of the cultivated food was gone or going. The root cellars had stores, but Garrett was right about February. If winter came hard, those stores would run short. The valley had about 40 families. She ran the numbers quietly in her head the way she'd been doing since she stood up from the creek bank that morning. How many people? How much food? How long? Then she thought about what she knew and what the valley floor held if you looked at it differently. Not as a place where crops had failed, but as a place where things still grew. She went home, started a fire, and began blanching the nettles. She didn't announce what she was doing. That was a deliberate choice. Maeve Callahan had lived in this valley long enough to understand that the fastest way to make people refuse something was to tell them it was good for them, especially proud people, especially people who were currently standing at a fence post processing the fact that everything they'd worked for had just been eaten by beetles. She cooked. She cooked all afternoon and into the evening, working through the nettles and the watercress and the lamb's quarters with the systematic efficiency her grandmother had taught her. Nettle soup with dried onion and a bit of salt pork from the cellar. Watercress sautéed in fat and finished with vinegar. Lamb's quarters mixed with corn flour and fried flat in the pan. Sorrel stirred into a sauce with the last of the winter butter. It didn't look like much. It never looked like much. But it smelled right. It smelled like food, which was a different smell than hunger. And right now the whole valley smelled like hunger. Gideon came in around supper time and stopped in the doorway. "What is all this?" he said. "Supper." He looked at the pots on the stove. He looked at the basket she'd left near the door, still half full. His expression was hard to read. There were several things moving across his face at once, and she got the sense he was sorting through them and choosing carefully. "The nettles," he said finally. "They're blanched. They won't sting." He sat down at the table. She set a bowl in front of him and watched him look at it. He picked up his spoon with the careful deliberateness of a man preparing himself for something uncertain. He took a bite. She waited. He took another bite. After a moment he said, without looking up, This is good. "I know. Why didn't you—" He stopped. "Why didn't I what?" He set his spoon down and looked at her. "I didn't know it tasted like this." She sat down across from him. "Most people don't. They don't know because they never tried. They never tried because everyone agreed the stuff was worthless, so no one ever asked whether that was true. Gideon looked at his bowl for a long moment. Then he picked up his spoon again. They ate in silence for a while. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that settles over a table when the food is good and people are hungry and there's something being understood that's too large to put into words right away. "How much of this do you have?" he asked toward the end. "What I gathered today. But there's more at the creek, more on the hillside to the east. There's a stand of cattails at the south bend that nobody's touched, acorns on the ridge, if we process them right. There are mushrooms in the timber that I haven't touched yet this season because I was waiting for them to—" She stopped herself. She was doing what she sometimes did, moving too fast, skipping the part where she brought someone else along. "There's a lot," she said instead, "more than most people know." Gideon nodded slowly. He was quiet for another long stretch. Then, "Maeve, what you know about all this, and is it enough?" She understood what he was asking. Not enough for the two of them. Enough for the valley. She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about most things. "I don't know," she said. "It depends on how many people are willing to learn. And how fast." He pushed his empty bowl back. "Then maybe," he said carefully, "you should start tomorrow." She went to the Pruitt cabin first, because Claire Pruitt had 3 children under 8 and would be practical about it rather than proud. She brought the leftover watercress from the night before and a bunch of lamb's quarters she'd pulled fresh that morning. Claire met her at the door with the wary, tired look that young mothers wore during a crisis. Not unfriendly exactly, but measuring. Figuring out whether whatever was being offered was worth the energy of receiving it. "Maeve," she said. "I've got greens," Maeve said. "If you'll let me come in, I'll show you where I found them and what to do with them. It's not complicated." Claire looked at the basket. She looked at Maeve. She was a practical woman, Claire Pruitt, and practical women in desperate circumstances were Maeve's best audience. "Come in," she said. They spent 2 hours in the Pruitt kitchen. Maeve showed her how to identify watercress by the shape of its leaf and the smell of the stem when you broke it. She showed her the difference between lamb's quarters and the plants that weren't safe. Not many in this particular valley, but there were 2, and the distinction mattered. She showed her how to handle nettles with a doubled cloth, and how long to blanch them before the sting was gone. Claire's oldest, a boy of 7 named Eli, watched from the doorway with enormous attention. Children were always Maeve's easiest students. They hadn't yet learned to be embarrassed by curiosity. "Can I come?" Eli asked. "To the creek? To find the plants?" "Ask your mother," Maeve said. Claire hesitated, then nodded. "Take your boots." By the end of the first week, Maeve had been to 6 cabins. Not all of them were welcoming. The Holt sent her away the first time. Tom Holt came to the door and told her they were managing fine, thank you, in the voice of a man who was not managing fine at all, but whose pride had chosen this hill to die on. The Garretts never invited her in, though she left a basket at their door twice, and both times it was taken inside by the time she passed again. Beatrice Crowell's house she avoided entirely. That was a later problem, and she had enough problems at present. But the families that came to her, or that let her come to them, were feeding themselves. Not well, not plentifully, but not starving either, which was the line that mattered most as August turned to September and the nights started carrying cold. She walked the creek every morning. She mapped the hillside mushroom stands in her head, marking which were in peak and which needed another week. She taught Claire Pruitt's son Eli to identify sorrel by taste, a lesson that required bravery from him on the first try, and produced a look of amazement on his face when the sharp lemony flavor hit his tongue. "It tastes like something," he said, genuinely surprised. "Most things do," Maeve told him. She walked home that evening with empty baskets and aching feet and the specific kind of tired that came from useful work. Behind her, the valley stretched out in the long autumn light, fields stripped bare, the beautiful, terrible emptiness of a harvest that never came. She looked at it without flinching. Somewhere in that valley were 40 families trying to figure out what came next. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't have most of them. But she had the creek and the hillside and 30 years of accumulated knowledge about what the land gave away for free to anyone patient enough to ask. That felt, for now, like enough to start with. The wind came off the northern mountains as she reached the cabin door, cold and clean, and carrying the smell of pine and something else, something sharper beneath it, like a season turning. She stood in it for a moment before going inside. The valley was quiet. The birds had not come back to the south fields. The frogs were still silent at the creek bend. But the watercress was growing in thick along the banks, denser than she'd seen it in 3 years, and the nettles were coming up strong at the north exposure where the soil stayed moist. She went inside and lit the lamp. The second week after the beetles came, Maeve stopped counting how many families she'd visited and started counting how many children knew what lamb's quarters looked like. The number was 11. 11 children ranging in age from Eli Pruitt's 7 years to the Decker twins at 13, who had started following her to the creek on Tuesday mornings with the kind of focused seriousness that hungry children develop fast. They carried small baskets their mothers had found or improvised. One boy used a feed sack folded at the corners, and they listened in a way that adults in this valley rarely did. No skepticism, no pride getting in the way. Just eyes and ears and hands, learning to do something that might keep them fed. Maeve taught them the same way her grandmother had taught her, by touch and smell and taste first, names second. She'd learned early that names without sensory memory were useless. A child who could identify watercress in a crowd of similar-looking plants by the particular pepperclean smell when you bruised a leaf was worth 10 adults who'd memorized a written description. "So smell a she'd say, crushing a stem between her fingers and holding it out. "Remember that. If it doesn't smell like that, don't put it in your mouth." "What if we're not sure?" Eli Pruitt asked once, very seriously. "If you're not sure, you leave it alone and find me." "What if you're not around?" She'd looked at him for a moment. He was a small boy with a gap between his front teeth and the kind of watchful intelligence that didn't always get recognized in children because it was quiet. "Then you leave it alone," she said. "The valley isn't going anywhere. There'll be another chance tomorrow." He'd seemed to find this genuinely comforting, the idea that patience was a form of safety. She hoped it would stick. It was Claire Pruitt who first told her about the whispers. Not maliciously, Claire wasn't a malicious woman, but with the careful neutrality of someone delivering information they knew would sting and wanted to get over with quickly. They were in the Pruitt kitchen on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks into September, processing a large batch of nettles while Eli sat at the table doing his letters. Claire had put water on and was folding the doubled cloth for handling before she said it. "People are talking," she said. Just that first, giving Maeve a moment to brace. "People were talking before the beetles," Maeve said. "What's the subject now?" Claire pressed her lips together. "That what you're feeding people isn't, that it might not be safe, for children especially." She said it to the cloth in her hands, not to Maeve's face. "Beatrice Crowell has been saying it to anyone who'll stand still long enough, that wild plants aren't meant to be eaten, that there's a reason settlers moved away from that sort of thing." Maeve was quiet for a moment. She picked up a bunch of nettles and began working through them with the doubled cloth, stripping the leaves from the stem in one practiced motion. "What do you think?" she asked. Claire finally looked at her. "I think my children have eaten nothing but what you've brought for 2 weeks, and they're fine. Better than fine, actually. Eli's color is better than it was all summer." She paused. "I also think Beatrice Crowell has never been hungry a day in her life, and that makes a person theoretical about what's safe and what isn't." Maeve almost smiled. "Theoretical," she repeated. "I'm just telling you what's being said, so you're not caught off guard." She wasn't caught off guard. She'd been expecting something like this since the first week, had felt it building in the undercurrents of the valley the same way she felt weather changes at the creek. Not visible yet, but present in the air, in the way sound moved. Communities under pressure needed someone to be suspicious of. It was an old pattern. She wasn't surprised to find herself filling that particular role. What she hadn't anticipated was how fast it would move. By the end of that same week, 3 families who had been coming to her quietly, learning, gathering, getting fed, stopped coming. No explanation, no note. They simply weren't at the meeting point on Friday morning when she came down to the creek with a bundle of dried nettle for demonstration. She waited 20 minutes, looked at the empty bank, and went on without them. Gideon heard it from Thomas Holt at the supply depot, where men gathered in the absence of anything else to do. Tom Holt had a loose mouth when he was anxious, and he'd been anxious for 2 weeks straight. He told Gideon that people were concerned, that nobody really knew what Maeve was putting in those plants, that it wasn't natural to be eating things off the ground like that, and had anyone actually thought about whether she knew what she was doing or whether she was just guessing. Gideon came home that evening and told Maeve about it in the even, careful tone he used when he was upset about something and was making himself be fair about it anyway. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked him what he thought. He sat with that question longer than she would have liked. "I think you know what you're doing," he said eventually. "I've eaten it every day for 2 weeks, and I'm standing here, so." He spread his hands, a gesture that wasn't quite as reassuring as he intended it to be. "But," she said, "but I wish—" He stopped, started again. "I wish it didn't look the way it looks. You out at dawn, alone, gathering things nobody else gathers. It makes people uneasy, and uneasy people say things," Maeve finished. "I know. I just think if you came at it differently, more, publicly, less like something you're doing on your own out of sight." She thought about that. He wasn't wrong, exactly. She'd been operating at the edges of the community because that was where she was most comfortable and where she'd been pushed by years of being unwelcome at the center. But he had a point that the edges looked different to a frightened community than they looked to her. "I'll think about it," she said. She thought about it all night, lying awake while the wind moved through the pine above the cabin roof. She was still thinking about it 3 days later when the boy got sick. His name was Danny Marsh, and he was 9 years old. He wasn't one of the children she'd been teaching. His family had been among the skeptics, his father Roger Marsh being a quiet man whose skepticism was private but thorough. Danny had apparently eaten some wild plants that a neighbor child had shared, which was exactly the kind of informal exchange Maeve had no control over. She found this out later, after everything had already happened. The fever came on fast, the way childhood fevers sometimes did. One evening, the boy was fine. The next morning, he was burning up and vomiting and making the frightened sounds that sick children make in the night. Roger Marsh sent for the valley's midwife, old Agnes Decker, who was also its closest thing to a medical practitioner until the traveling doctor came through. Agnes sat with the boy through the first night and told Roger Marsh to keep the fever down with cold cloths and water. By the second day, the boy was no better. His mother, a thin, anxious woman named Ruth, was barely holding herself together, and that was when Beatrice Crowell arrived. Maeve heard about this secondhand, from Claire, who heard it from Agnes Decker herself, who had been present. Beatrice came to the Marsh cabin on the morning of the second day with a jar of preserved plums and a particular expression that certain women wore when they arrived at a tragedy carrying both condolences and conclusions. She sat with Ruth Marsh in the front room. She held Ruth's hand. She said the things that frightened mothers needed to hear, which were not the things Agnes Decker was saying from the other room. And at some point, Claire wasn't sure exactly how it came up, only that it did. Beatrice said, "You know the Callahan woman has been feeding the children wild plants from the creek. Nobody knows what's in them, really. Agnes does her best, but she's not a doctor." Ruth Marsh's eyes had apparently filled with tears. Not accusatory tears, just the tears of a woman whose child was sick and who was exhausted and afraid and who needed somewhere to put all of that. "Danny did eat something a neighbor boy brought," Ruth had said, 2 days before the fever started. That was all Beatrice needed. By afternoon, the story had moved through the valley the way stories moved in tight communities. Not in a line, but in all directions at once, touching every household within hours, arriving slightly changed at each stop. By the time it reached the outer farms, it had become, "The Callahan woman fed wild plants to the children, and now one of them is sick with a fever that Agnes Decker can't bring down, and nobody knows how many others might be next." Maeve didn't hear it until the following morning, when Claire came to her door early, before the children were up, with her jaw set in the particular way that meant she was angry on someone else's behalf. "You need to know what's being said," Claire told her, and said it. Maeve stood in the doorway with her coffee gone cold in her hand and listened. She didn't interrupt. When Claire finished, she stood there for another moment in silence. "Is the boy still sick?" she asked. "Still feverish, but Agnes says it's moving the right direction. She's seen this fever before. It goes through the valley every 2 or 3 years in fall. She said so to Roger Marsh directly. Does Roger Marsh believe her? Claire's expression shifted. He's scared, Maeve. Scared fathers aren't very logical. Beatrice got to him before Agnes could frame it right. And now She shook her head. He's not thinking clearly. What about the other families? The ones I've been working with? Claire looked at her feet for a moment. The Deckers sent word that they won't be at the creek Friday. The Hendersons the same. She paused. I'm still coming. I want you to know that. And Eli's still coming. I'm not letting some gossip undo 2 weeks of actual food. Maeve appreciated that more than she said. Thank you. Don't thank me, just, what are you going to do? She thought about it. Keep going, she said. Claire looked at her with the expression of someone who wasn't sure if that was courage or stubbornness, and had landed on the conclusion that in this particular case, it might not matter which. What happened next arrived at Maeve's door on a Tuesday evening after dark. Not a person. A note, folded and tucked under the door without a knock. She found it when she went to let the cat in. It was written on cheap paper in a hand she didn't recognize, 3 lines in pencil that had been pressed hard enough to nearly tear through. Stop feeding the children your weeds. If another one gets sick because of you, we will make sure you wish you had stopped sooner. This is a warning. She read it twice. Stood there with it in her hand for a long moment. Then she folded it back along its creases and set it on the mantel. Gideon found it there the next morning. He read it standing up, still in his coat from checking the water trough, and when he turned to her, his face was doing something she'd never quite seen on it before. Not anger exactly, but something harder and more deliberate, like a decision being made. Who wrote this? He said. Not a question. I don't know. Beatrice Crowell. Possibly. I can't prove it. She was at the stove and she went on stirring what she was stirring because her hands needed something to do. It might not be her. It might be Roger Marsh. It might be any of a dozen people who are frightened and don't know what to do with it. It doesn't matter who it is. This is a threat. I know what it is. Then why are you... He gestured at her, at the stove, at her general air of continued activity. Why aren't you more upset? She looked at him. I am upset. I'm furious, actually. I'm furious that 2 weeks of feeding people's children has gotten me an unsigned note in the dark. I'm furious that Danny Marsh gets a seasonal fever and it becomes my fault before the ink is dry. I'm furious that Beatrice Crowell can say anything she wants about me and people will believe it before they'll believe what's in their own children's improved color. She stopped, took a breath. But being furious doesn't change any of those things. So, Gideon looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the note, still in his hand. I'm going to talk to Roger Marsh, he said. Don't. She said it quickly and firmly. Roger Marsh is scared, and his boy is sick. And if you go there angry, it makes everything worse. Leave Roger Marsh alone. He put the note down on the table. Neither of them touched it again that day. The anonymous threats continued irregularly. Not every night, sometimes 3 or 4 days would pass without one. But they kept coming, folded under the door or tucked under the rock nearest the front step, always unsigned, always the same basic message dressed in different words. Stop. You'll be sorry. Leave the children alone. Maeve put each one on the mantel. She didn't know exactly why. It wasn't calculation exactly, more instinct. They were evidence of something, and throwing them away felt wrong. She kept going to the creek. She kept teaching the children who still came, which was fewer than before. Eli Pruitt and his younger sister, 2 of the Decker children whose grandmother Agnes apparently overruled the family's hesitation on the grounds that she wasn't going to let community gossip override the evidence of her own medical eyes. 4 children, down from 11. She kept bringing food to the families who would take it, which was also fewer. Claire Pruitt, Agnes Decker, who had quietly started serving nettle soup at her own table. A young widow named Sadie Voss, who had no particular opinion about the gossip, but had 3 small children and an empty pantry, and wasn't in any position to let pride make decisions for her. The valley's general temperature had shifted. She felt it when she walked the main road, the way conversations paused when she approached, the way certain women's eyes would move away from hers. Not everyone, but enough. That particular social weather, familiar from 3 years of being the strange woman wandering the creek, but sharper now, more pointed. Beatrice Crowell crossed the main road rather than pass her directly one Wednesday afternoon. An elaborate pantomime, made more elaborate by the presence of two other women who watched Beatrice do it and then found reasons to look elsewhere. Maeve watched it happen and kept walking. That evening she sat at the table after Gideon had gone to bed and spread out the pieces of cloth she used for mapping. Not a formal map, just a practical one. Marks in charcoal indicating where the good plant stands were, where she'd harvested heavy, and where she'd been careful to leave enough to grow back. She'd been thinking about the cattails at the south bend, which she hadn't touched yet. Processed right, the cattail pollen was good flour and the roots were dense with starch. One productive stand could supplement a family's diet through the worst of winter if they knew how to use it. She thought about Danny Marsh, who was apparently recovering. Agnes Decker had confirmed it was a straightforward seasonal fever, just as she'd said from the beginning, running its course on schedule. The boy was sitting up and eating again. He would be fine. She thought about what would happen when that information moved through the valley, whether it would be enough to shift things back, or whether the version of events that Beatrice Crowell had set loose was too well established now to be dislodged by something as inconvenient as a full recovery. She thought about the note on the mantel. Then she thought about the watercress, coming in thick and clean at the creek bend, and the mushroom stand on the east slope that was just reaching peak, and the acorns ripening on the ridge, and winter coming whether anyone in this valley was ready for it or not. She refolded her cloth maps carefully and put out the lamp. Outside, the wind moved through the pine above the cabin roof, the same sound it made every night, the same sound it had made before any of them arrived in this valley and would make long after. The creek ran low and quiet in the dark. The mountains to the north held the last of the day's warmth in their stone faces for another hour, then let it go. Maeve went to bed, set her boots by the door so she could find them in the dark, lay down next to her sleeping husband and stared at the ceiling and thought, with the careful, unsentimental clarity that had always been her particular kind of stubbornness, Danny Marsh is going to be fine. The plants didn't hurt anyone. I know what I know. It wasn't comfort exactly, but it was enough to sleep on. She was at the creek before dawn. Danny Marsh was sitting up on his own by the fifth day, eating broth and asking about his dog, which Agnes Decker took as the clearest possible sign that the boy was going to be fine. She told Roger Marsh this directly, standing in the front room of the Marsh cabin with her medical bag in her hand, and the particular no-argument tone she used when she wanted to head off further foolishness. "It's the valley fever," she said. "Same as the Colton boy had 2 falls ago. Same as the Whitaker girl the fall before that. Goes through every couple of years, always in September, always hits the young ones hardest, always breaks by the end of the week. It has nothing to do with what he ate." Roger Marsh sat in the chair by the window with his hands on his knees and nodded slowly. He was a quiet man, as Maeve had understood, and in the absence of crisis, his natural temperament was reasonable. "Agnes," he said, "I hear you." "I do. He stopped and rubbed his face with both hands. Ruth was terrified. I was terrified. When someone says there might be a reason, you ask that someone for evidence, Agnes said flatly. Not rumors. Evidence. She picked up her bag. Beatrice Crowell has never treated a sick child in her life. I have been treating sick children in this valley for 19 years. You might consider whose opinion carries more weight on the medical question. She left Roger Marsh sitting there with that, which she told Claire Pruitt later was the most she could do for a man whose fear had already done the damage. Clearing the name was one thing. Clearing the feeling was another, slower business. Maeve heard all of this from Claire, who had become in these weeks a kind of informal intelligence on the valley's interior weather. Not through any taste for gossip, but because Claire talked to Agnes, and Agnes talked to everyone in the course of her work, and Claire understood that Maeve needed to know what was moving through the community, whether it was comfortable information or not. "Agnes is on your side," Claire said, solidly. "She told 3 different families this week that the fever had nothing to do with you." "Did they believe her?" Claire hesitated. "Some of them. The Pruitts, obviously. The Deckers. Old Harlan Webb said Agnes Decker had forgotten more medicine than Beatrice Crowell would ever know, which, coming from Harlan, is about as ringing an endorsement as you'll get. And the others?" Another hesitation. Longer. "The others they're not all convinced. Beatrice has been... She's persistent, Maeve. I won't sugarcoat it. She's been telling people that Agnes is too loyal to admit when something's wrong. That she's covering for you. Maeve sat with that for a moment. The specific audacity of it was almost impressive. The idea that Agnes Decker, who had 19 years of medical work in this valley and a reputation built on nothing but competence and availability, was somehow compromised by loyalty to the strange woman who gathered creek plants. "What does Beatrice Crowell want?" Maeve asked. Not rhetorically. She genuinely wanted Claire's reading of it. Claire thought about it seriously. "I think she wants things to go back to the way they were," she said finally. "Before the Beatles, before you became necessary. When she was the most capable woman in the valley, and you were the odd one people laughed about." She paused. "I don't think she set out to be cruel. I think she's scared of what it means that you were right." That was a more generous interpretation than Maeve might have offered on her own, but she respected Claire's instinct for people, and she filed it away. "The notes have stopped," she said. "I know. I think whoever was writing them got nervous after Agnes started talking. Or they're waiting." Claire looked at her. "What are you going to do?" Maeve had been thinking about that question for 3 days. Not in an urgent way, more in the slow, thorough way she thought about things that mattered. She'd been turning it over the same way she turned soil with a stick to see what was underneath, looking at it from different angles, testing the weight of different approaches. "I'm going to cook," she said. Eleanor Briggs was 71 years old, and she had been in Red Willow Valley longer than almost anyone. She'd come with the first wave of settlers when the valley was still without a proper road, had buried a husband and 2 children here, had watched the community grow from 8 families to 40 over 3 decades of hard seasons and occasional good ones. She lived alone in the original Briggs cabin at the north end of the valley, a small, solid structure that had outlasted everything built after it, and she received visitors on her own terms, which generally meant they knocked twice and waited. Maeve had spoken to Eleanor Briggs perhaps 6 times in 3 years. Not unfriendly conversations. Eleanor Briggs was not unfriendly, exactly, but she was economical with her attention and careful about who she extended it to. She had watched Maeve from a distance, with the particular quality of attention that suggested she was making up her mind about something, and Maeve had never been sure which direction that judgment had landed. She knocked twice and waited. Eleanor opened the door after a moment. She was a small woman who gave the impression of being larger than she was, with white hair pulled back without ceremony, and sharp dark eyes that moved over Maeve and the 2 baskets she carried with a look of undisguised assessment. "Maeve Callahan," she said. "Mrs. Briggs, I was hoping for a few minutes of your time." "Come in, then." She stepped back from the door. "I've been expecting you, more or less." The cabin was spare and orderly, the way long-lived alone people's spaces tended to be. Everything with a purpose and a place. Eleanor sat in the chair by the window and watched Maeve set her baskets on the kitchen table. "You've heard what's being said," Maeve said. It wasn't a question. "I hear everything that's said in this valley, eventually. I've been here long enough that people forget to filter themselves around me." A pause. "Agnes Decker came by yesterday. She told me she planned to. She made a persuasive case." Eleanor's expression didn't give much away. "What is it you want from me, specifically?" Maeve had thought about how to answer this. She'd practiced it, actually, the night before, which was something she almost never did. She was not naturally a prepared speech person, but this mattered too much to trust to improvisation. "I want to cook for people," she said, publicly, not at the creek, not in someone's kitchen, in the open, where the valley can see it. The elders first, the families who are most uncertain, not asking for trust, just serving food and letting them eat it. She paused. "I'd like you to sit at the table." Eleanor Briggs looked at her for a long moment. Outside, a wind moved through the old birch trees along the north fence, the last of their leaves catching the light, pale yellow against the gray October sky. "You understand what you're asking," Eleanor said. "If you sit someone like me down to eat your food publicly, and anything goes wrong." "Nothing will go wrong. I know what's in every plant I've gathered. I know how to prepare them. Agnes Decker will be there. If anything looked uncertain to me, if I had the smallest doubt about anything I was serving, I wouldn't serve it." "That's not what I meant." Eleanor tilted her head slightly. If you make a public move like this and people still refuse to believe it, if Beatrice Crowell manages to keep the story moving in the wrong direction even after, it's harder to recover from a public failure than a quiet one. I know that. And you still want to do it. I still want to do it. Another silence. Eleanor looked at the baskets on the table, then back at Maeve. What are you making? She asked. Maeve let out a breath she hadn't fully noticed she was holding. Nettle soup. Watercress with the last of the season's vinegar. Cattail flour bread. I've been developing the recipe for 3 weeks and it's better than it sounds. Sorrel sauce with dried venison. And something sweet. Wood violet preserves that I put up in August, before anyone was asking me to justify what I did with my mornings. The corner of Eleanor Briggs's mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was in that direction. Wood violet preserves, she said. They're good. I'll bring a jar to prove it before Saturday if you want. Eleanor stood up. She was small, but she stood straight, with the posture of a woman who had decided long ago not to let age make her apologize for taking up space. Saturday at noon, she said, at the clearing by the community well. It's the most visible ground in the valley. I'll be there. She paused. I'll also send word to the Hendersons and the Garretts and Harlan Webb. People listen to Harlan even when they'd prefer not to. Thank you, Maeve said. Don't thank me yet. Eleanor looked at her with those sharp, dark eyes. If the food is bad, I'll say so. I won't protect you from the truth to be kind. I wouldn't want you to. Eleanor gave a short nod that closed the subject. Saturday, she said again, and went to put the kettle on. Gideon found out about it that evening when Maeve came home and told him directly. She'd learned over 4 years of marriage that telling Gideon things indirectly or gradually rarely worked in her favor. He was a man who needed the full information at once, or he filled in the gaps with his own anxiety, which was usually worse than reality. He stood in the kitchen doorway and listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, Saturday. Saturday. That's 3 days. Yes. He turned toward the window and stood there for a moment. His hands were at his sides. She watched the set of his shoulders and tried to read what was moving through him. Eleanor Briggs, he said finally. She agreed to come. Eleanor Briggs doesn't agree to things unless she thinks they're worth agreeing to. He said this slowly, not to her, more like he was putting it together in his own mind. He turned back around. What do you need me to do? It was the right question. She hadn't been sure he'd ask it, had prepared herself for the alternative, for the careful, worried sentences about risk and reputation and the wisdom of keeping a lower profile. The fact that he asked the right question instead did something complicated to her chest that she decided not to examine too closely right now. Help me gather tomorrow and Friday, she said. I need larger quantities than I can pull alone in 3 days, and I need someone to help carry. Done. Also, she hesitated. I need you to tell Tom Holt. Gideon blinked. Tom Holt. He's a loud man who doesn't like me, which means if he comes on Saturday and eats the food and doesn't die, it'll mean more than if Agnes Decker and Eleanor Briggs sit there. Everyone expects Agnes and Eleanor to be on my side. Tom Holt being there changes the picture. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. Tom Holt is not going to come because I told him about it. I know, but if you tell him in the right way, What's the right way? She thought about it. Tell him Eleanor Briggs will be there and that she specifically asked whether he was coming. She paused. He won't be able to stay away if he thinks Eleanor Briggs is watching whether he shows up. Gideon stared at her. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite categorize. It was between admiration and the mildly unsettled feeling of realizing you've underestimated a person you see every day. You've thought about this, he said. I've had 3 days and not much else to think about. He put his hat back on. I'll talk to Holt tonight. Wednesday and Thursday she gathered. Gideon came with her, both days, leaving before dawn and working through the morning with a methodical efficiency that surprised her, not because she doubted he was capable of it, but because she'd never seen him apply it to her work before. He carried without complaining. He asked questions, real questions, not the polite, half-interested kind, but the kind that meant he was actually trying to understand. Why this plant and not that one? How do you know this one's ready? What does the smell tell you that the color doesn't? She answered all of them. There was something strange and not unpleasant about being asked, By Thursday evening, they had more than she needed for the meal itself. She'd wanted surplus, wanted the table to look abundant rather than carefully rationed. She spent Thursday night in the kitchen working through the preparation in sequence. Nettle soup base that would just need reheating, watercress cleaned and ready, cattail flour bread dough that she'd bake fresh Saturday morning, sorrel sauce done and jarred. The violet preserves she'd already put up months ago, 6 jars of them, a deep jewel purple that looked better than it had any right to coming from something people called a weed. Agnes Decker came by on Friday afternoon to look at the menu. She moved through the kitchen examining things with the same focused efficiency she brought to sick patients, picking up jars, smelling things, tasting a small piece of the cattail bread test loaf Maeve had baked for her own assessment. "This is genuinely good," Agnes said, sounding slightly startled. "I told you it was better than it sounded." "You did." Agnes set the bread down. "Roger Marsh came to see me yesterday." Maeve looked up from the sorrel sauce she was adjusting. "He wanted to apologize," Agnes said. "In his way, he's not an articulate man about this kind of thing, but he said he understood the fever was the fever and that he was sorry the situation had developed the way it had." "Did he say anything about Saturday?" "He said he wasn't sure he could come, but he wasn't sure he couldn't." Agnes looked at her. "Which is better than a flat no." "What about Beatrice Crowell?" Agnes made a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "I didn't ask Beatrice Crowell, and I don't recommend you do either, for the moment." Maeve nodded. She hadn't intended to. "There'll be people on Saturday who come to watch for the wrong reasons," Agnes said. "You know that." "I know. People who want something to go wrong, or who come prepared to say it went wrong regardless." "I know that too. And you're going ahead." "Agnes." She set down her spoon. "Danny Marsh had the valley fever. My food didn't hurt anyone. I know what I've gathered, and I know how to prepare it, and I know it's safe. The only way to demonstrate a true thing is to demonstrate it. Arguing with a rumor doesn't kill it. Feeding people does." Agnes looked at her for a long moment with the careful eyes of someone who has spent 2 decades watching what actually works and what doesn't in situations that involve human fear and stubbornness. "All right," she said finally. "I'll be there at 11:30 to help set up." Saturday came in cold and clear, the kind of October morning that made the mountains look close enough to touch, every ridge and tree line sharp against a sky that had gone an almost painful shade of blue. Maeve was up at 4, baking the bread, reheating the soup base over a low fire, packing everything into the covered carriers Gideon had built from timber scraps on Friday evening without being asked. They carried it to the well clearing together. Eleanor Briggs was already there when they arrived, standing in her good wool coat with her arms folded and her breath making small clouds in the cold air. She looked at the covered carriers and gave a short, approving nod. "Agnes is 5 minutes behind me," Eleanor said. "Harlan Webb said he'd come if his knee held." "Who else?" "More than you might think, less than you deserve." She said it plainly, without the kind of softening that would have made it condescending. "Set up your table." They set up. Gideon laid the boards across the sawhorses he'd carried down. Maeve arranged the food the way she'd thought about it. The bread sliced and laid out, the soup in the big iron pot over the small fire they'd built at the edge of the clearing, the watercress dressed in a white bowl, the violet preserve in its dark jar at the center where the color would draw the eye. People came in 1s and 2s, not a crowd. It was never going to be a crowd, not on a first attempt, not with the valley's mood still carrying the shape of Beatrice Crowell's whisper campaign, but more than Maeve had let herself hope for. Harlan Webb arrived with his cane and his knee apparently cooperating, at least temporarily. Agnes was there at 11:30 as promised. Claire Pruitt came with Eli and his sister. The Decker family arrived together, Agnes's granddaughter holding tight to her grandmother's hand. Tom Holt arrived at noon exactly. He came alone, without his wife, which suggested to Maeve that he hadn't told her he was coming. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, looked at the table, looked at the people already eating, looked at Eleanor Briggs sitting in the chair someone had brought her with a bowl of nettle soup and the particular composed expression of a woman who had decided she was going to enjoy her lunch. He stood there for a moment. Eleanor looked up and caught his eye. She didn't say anything. She just picked up her spoon and took another deliberate bite of soup. Tom Holt walked over to the table. Maeve served him herself. She didn't say anything either, just ladled the soup, cut a slice of bread, and handed him the bowl. He took it. He stood at the edge of the table and ate standing up, which was exactly how she'd expected him to do it, because Tom Holt wasn't the kind of man who could admit to sitting down at a table he'd publicly doubted. He ate the soup, he ate the bread, he tried the watercress with an expression of concentrated judgment that eventually settled into something that was not praise, but was clearly not complaint either. He put his empty bowl down. "Good bread," he said, to no one in particular. Then he walked away. It was the smallest possible acknowledgement. It was, from Tom Holt on this particular Saturday in October, worth more than a speech. Eleanor Briggs caught Maeve's eye from across the clearing and gave her a look that said she'd seen it and understood what it meant. The gathering lasted 2 hours. People drifted in and out, some eating quickly and leaving, some staying longer. 3 people Maeve hadn't seen in her kitchen since the rumors started came and ate without comment, which was, she was learning, often how this valley made its corrections. Not with apology, not with ceremony, but with the quiet act of returning. Beatrice Crowell did not come. Maeve had not expected her to. What she hadn't expected was Ruth Marsh. She arrived late, after most people had already eaten, walking from the south end of the clearing with her hands in her coat pockets and her face doing the thing that faces did when someone was making a difficult decision with every step. She was alone. She stopped at the table and looked at the food, and then she looked at Maeve. "Danny's doing well?" she said. Her voice was careful and thin, but she held it steady. "I heard," Maeve said. "I'm glad." Ruth looked at the soup. "Is there enough left?" Maeve picked up the ladle. Ruth Marsh ate a bowl of nettle soup standing at the edge of the well clearing in the thin October sunlight, with her empty coat pockets and her relieved mother's eyes. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She ate the soup, and when it was gone, she set the bowl down on the table and said, "It's good," in a quiet voice that was as close to everything she needed to say as she was apparently able to get right now. "Come to the creek Monday," Maeve said. "I'll show you where I found the nettles." Ruth Marsh looked at her for a moment with an expression that was complicated and a little raw. Then she nodded, once, and walked back the way she'd come. The traveling doctor arrived in Red Willow Valley on the following Wednesday, 6 weeks into his circuit through the frontier settlements. His name was Bernard Alt, and he was a compact, precise man who wore his coat buttoned to the top, regardless of temperature, and kept his medical bag organized with the kind of obsessive orderliness that suggested a mind that needed its outer environment to compensate for how much it processed. He went to the Marsh cabin first, as he always did when he heard a child had been ill. He examined Danny, pronounced him fully recovered, asked Agnes Decker for her notes on the presentation and progression of the fever, and spent 20 minutes cross-referencing them with the records he kept of every valley he'd passed through in the last 8 years. Then he came to find Maeve. She was at the creek, of course she was, when Gideon came down the path to tell her the doctor was at the cabin waiting. She came back with her baskets, still damp at the hem of her skirt from the bank, and found Bernard Alt sitting at her kitchen table with his bag on the floor beside him and a cup of coffee Gideon had apparently provided. He stood when she came in, which she hadn't expected. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. He used her married name, which almost no one in the valley did. She'd always been Maeve Callahan to herself and everyone else. "Dr. Bernard Alt, I've been hearing about your work since I came into the valley this morning." She set her baskets down. "Good things or bad things?" "Both," he said, with the directness of a man who had learned that honesty in a medical context was usually kinder than management. "Agnes Decker gave me the thorough version, which was good. 3 separate people told me you'd been poisoning children, which was the other kind." He sat back down and opened his bag. "I'd like to look at what you've been gathering, if you're willing." She showed him. All of it. The watercress, the lamb's quarters, the nettles, the cattail flower she'd been processing, the mushrooms she'd dried, the acorns she was still working through the tannin treatment on. He examined each one with the same focused precision he'd applied to Danny Marsh's recovery record, occasionally asking a question, occasionally making a note in the small book he kept in his breast pocket. "The nettles," he said. "You're blanching them thoroughly?" 3 minutes in boiling water. The sting is entirely gone after 90 seconds. But I do 3 to be certain. "And the mushrooms? You're confident in the identification?" I've been identifying this specific variety for 15 years. My grandmother taught me. I've never once been uncertain about these. He looked at her over his notes. Your grandmother was a forager? My grandmother knew what the land had in it. She grew up in a time when you had to. Maeve paused. It's knowledge that went out of fashion when it stopped being necessary. And then the beetles came and it turned out it was still necessary. Alt looked at her for a moment with an expression that was harder to read than Agnes Decker's or Eleanor Briggs's, more neutral, more professional. Then he said, The boy's fever was a standard seasonal occurrence. I've documented it in 7 valleys across this region over the past 8 years. It correlates with cooling temperatures and certain airborne conditions that I haven't fully characterized yet. It has no relationship whatsoever to diet. He closed his book. I will say that in writing to the Valley's informal leadership, I'll leave a copy of the document with Agnes Decker and one with whoever functions as the settlement's record keeper. That's Elias Garrett, Maeve said. I'll see Garrett this afternoon. He stood, picked up his bag, then paused. Mrs. Mercer, what you've been doing, the gathering, the teaching. I've seen the effects of food insecurity in frontier settlements through bad harvests. I've seen what happens to children who don't have enough. What you've managed to do here, with the resources available to you. He stopped himself, the way precise men sometimes stop themselves when they felt they were veering into territory beyond their professional register. It's valuable, he said finally. Genuinely valuable. Oh, tell that to the Valley, she said, without bitterness. Just plainly. I intend to. He put on his hat. The Danny Marsh situation. I'll make the record absolutely clear. There will be no ambiguity remaining after I'm done. He nodded to Gideon, nodded to her, and went out the door. Gideon waited until his footsteps faded on the path before saying quietly, That's the doctor saying you were right. I know what he said. It's official now, on paper. Yes. He looked at her. She looked back at him. Outside, the October wind moved through the pine above the roof, the same sound it always made, the sound that had been there through all of it, through the beetles and the empty fields and the notes on the mantel and the well clearing on Saturday and Ruth Marsh's bowl of soup and Bernard Alt's careful handwriting in his small breast pocket book. Does it help? He asked. The official part. She thought about it honestly. It helped with some things and not with others. It helped with the families who needed permission to return, who had been waiting for something external and authoritative to make the turn feel safe. It helped with Elias Garrett, who was a man who respected written records. It helped with whatever Roger Marsh was still working through in his quiet way. It didn't help with Beatrice Crowell, who wasn't going to be persuaded by a document. That was a different problem, one that official vindication didn't touch. Some, she said. It helped some. Gideon nodded slowly. He wasn't the kind of man who pushed for more than that. Not anymore. She was learning that about him in these weeks, in the same way she was learning things about the Valley. Slowly, and through paying attention, and with the understanding that what you learned changed what you saw without necessarily making it simpler. She went to put the kettle on. The baskets from the morning still sat by the door, the last of the season's watercress, dark and fragrant and alive, and through the window the mountains held their position against the sky the way they always did, patient, enormous, indifferent, and entirely reliable. Bernard Alt spent 4 days in Red Willow Valley before continuing his circuit, and in those 4 days he moved through the settlement with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that his time was always limited and his impact always uncertain. He saw Elias Garrett and left the written record as promised. He visited the families with young children and checked them over with the thoroughness that had made his reputation across the frontier. He ate supper with Agnes Decker on his last evening and spent 2 hours comparing notes with her on the particular pattern of autumn fevers in High Valley settlements. Before he left, he stopped by Maeve's cabin one more time. She was in the yard processing the last of the season's acorns through the tannin leaching process. A slow, laborious operation that required repeated water changes over 2 days, but produced a flour that was mild and workable and dense with nutrition. He stood at the fence and watched her for a moment. The document is with Garrett, he said. I made it plain. No equivocation about the cause of the boy's fever. I know, he sent word. Agnes tells me you've been continuing to teach despite everything that's happened. Maeve didn't look up from the acorn paste she was working through the cloth. People still need to eat. Alt was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man with something more to say who was deciding whether to say it. There's a settlement 2 valleys east of here, he said finally. Corbin Creek. They had a bad beetle 3 seasons ago, and it nearly destroyed them. Lost 4 children to hunger that winter. He paused. What you've built here, the knowledge you've distributed, the skills those children are learning, that's the difference between a community that survives a bad year and one that doesn't. I want you to understand that I don't say that lightly. She stopped working and looked at him. He met her eyes with the same directness he brought to medical examinations. No flattery in it, no social performance, just the plain statement of someone who had seen enough bad outcomes to recognize a good one when it was still in progress. Thank you, she said. He nodded, put on his hat, and went to collect his horse. She went back to her acorn paste, but she thought about Corbin Creek for the rest of that afternoon, and about the 4 children whose names she would never know, and about the difference between knowledge that stayed inside one person and knowledge that moved. The community's return was not a tide. It was more like thaw, the kind that happened in late winter when the temperature crept up by degrees too small to feel individually, but accumulated into something undeniable. It moved at the pace of people's pride, which was slow, and at the pace of their hunger, which was faster. Ruth Marsh came to the creek on Monday, as she'd said she would. She came alone without Danny, who was fully recovered but still being kept close by a mother who hadn't entirely forgiven the universe for frightening her. And she was quiet for most of the morning in the watchful way of people learning something they felt they should already know. Maeve taught her without comment on the situation between them, because the situation was what it was, and laboring over it wouldn't change anything. She showed her the watercress, the sorrel, the last of the season's nettles, which were going tough now but still usable if you took only the newest growth at the tips. Ruth asked good questions, practical, specific questions, the kind that came from someone who was actually imagining using the information rather than just receiving it to be polite. By the end of the morning, she could identify the 3 main creek plants reliably and knew how to process the nettles safely. Walking back along the upper path, Ruth said without looking at Maeve directly, I should have come to you sooner. Instead of listening to what was being said, Maeve considered several responses. You were scared, she said finally. I was, but a scared mother with a sick child is going to reach for the nearest explanation. That's not a character flaw. It's just what fear does. She paused. I don't hold it against you. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then, Beatrice Crowell is... She stopped. You don't have to explain Beatrice Crowell to me. No. A pause. No, I suppose not. They walked in silence for a bit. The path curved along the hillside above the valley floor, and from this angle you could see the full spread of it below. The stripped fields still bare, the cabins with their thin smoke trails, the well clearing where the Saturday meal had happened, visible as an open space among the trees. It looked smaller from up here. Most things did. She won't stop, Ruth said. Not about the valley, specifically about Beatrice. She's been telling people the doctor was too quick to conclude. That one clear record isn't proof of anything. Maeve had heard this. Agnes had told her. I know. Does it worry you? She thought about it honestly. Some, less than it did. She looked out over the valley. People are eating. Children are learning. The knowledge is moving even when Beatrice is talking. At some point, the evidence outweighs the whisper. Ruth looked at her with an expression that was something between admiration and the slight discomfort of someone who has just realized another person is tougher than they expected. You're not what I thought you were, she said. What did you think I was? A pause. Odd, Ruth said carefully. Strange. The woman who wanders the creek at dawn. People said they implied you didn't quite... She stopped again. Fit, Maeve supplied. Yes. I don't particularly. She said it without heat. But fitting in was never the point. The point was knowing what I know and whether it turned out to be useful. She glanced at Ruth. It turned out to be useful. Ruth Marsh almost smiled. It was a small, complicated smile, the kind worn by people making peace with having been wrong. Yes, she said. It did. Gideon had changed in ways that were quiet, but not small. Maeve noticed it in the accumulated details of daily life. The way he came to the creek without being asked now, the way he'd started keeping his own rough notes on what they gathered and where the strongest stands were. He'd built her 3 new carrying frames from light timber, properly balanced, better than the improvised baskets she'd been using for years. He'd done it without announcement, just set them by the door one morning when she came in from the yard. He was also talking differently to people. She heard it secondhand mostly, from Claire, from Agnes, from Eli Pruitt, who repeated adult conversations with the unfiltered accuracy of a 7-year-old who didn't understand why he shouldn't. At the supply depot, at the fence line conversations that men had while pretending to look at something else, Gideon had started talking about the foraging work the way a man talked about his own enterprise. Not defensively, not in the posture of someone managing a difficult situation with their wife, in the posture of someone genuinely proud of a thing worth being proud of. She asked him about it one evening, directly. "Claire says you told Tom Holt I was the most knowledgeable person in the valley about wild plants." Her words. Gideon was sharpening a blade at the table and didn't look up. "Claire talks too much." "Is it true?" He worked the blade across the stone twice. Then, "I said you knew more about how to keep people fed through a bad season than anyone else here, which is true, which I should have understood 3 years ago." He set the stone down. "I didn't, and I'm not going to pretend I did, and I can't undo it. But I can say it now." Maeve sat down across from him. She looked at his hands on the whetstone, the roughness of them, the particular way they moved with the careful attention he gave to tools, to things that needed to be kept in working order. "You came to the creek with me," she said, "every morning this week." "Yes." "That matters more than what you said to Tom Holt." He finally looked up. Something moved across his face. Not quite relief, not quite absolution, but something adjacent to both. "I wish I'd come sooner," he said. "I know." She paused. "But you came." They sat with that for a moment. It wasn't a resolved thing. There were years of careful silences and particular distances between them that wouldn't be unwound by a single difficult season, however clarifying that season had been. But something had shifted in its foundations. She could feel it the way she felt weather, not in one definitive sign, but in the accumulation of smaller ones. "Next spring," Gideon said, "when the planting happens, I want to put in a proper demonstration bed. Near the cabin, visible from the road. Wild plants arranged so people can see what they look like, learn to identify them without going to the creek. Something permanent." He paused. "If you'll plan it, I'll build whatever structure you need." She looked at him. "That's a good idea." "I know it's a good idea. I got it from watching you explain the same plants to the same families 6 times because they couldn't remember where the stand was." She almost laughed. It came up in her chest, and she let a little of it out, quietly. "Claire was right. You told Tom Holt." "I told several people. Holt was the loudest recipient, which made it the most useful." He picked up the blade again. "Are you going to be annoyed about that?" "No." "Good." He went back to sharpening. Silas Boone arrived at Maeve's door on a Thursday morning in late October, unannounced and alone. She recognized him before she had the door fully open. He was hard to miss, a large man with a large presence, the kind that took up a door frame the way certain trees took up skyline. He ran the biggest cattle operation in the eastern section of the valley, a man whose opinion carried weight in proportion to his acreage, which was considerable. He'd been at the edge of the Saturday meal gathering. She'd noticed him, standing well back, watching without eating. She'd assumed he'd conclude what he came prepared to conclude and leave, and that had apparently been his plan too. But he was here. He held his hat in his hands, which was a small thing but told her something. Silas Boone was not a hat-in-hands kind of man by nature. "Mrs. Callahan," he said. "Mercer. People use both. I wasn't sure." "Callahan is fine," she said. "Come in." He came in with the slight awkwardness of a large man in a small kitchen, sat in the chair she indicated, and put his hat on the table in front of him. He looked at it for a moment. "My children have been eating what you've been sending with the Pruitt boy," he said, "since about 3 weeks in." She hadn't known that. Eli Pruitt had apparently been operating as an informal distribution point she hadn't authorized. She filed this information without reaction. "Are they well?" she asked. "Better than well." He said this to the hat. "My youngest, she had color in her face last week I haven't seen since spring. My wife noticed it." He paused. "My wife is who told me to come here. I wasn't—" Another pause. "I want to be straight with you. I wasn't going to. I had opinions about what you were doing that I'm not proud of now." "What changed your mind?" She sat down across from him. He looked up from the hat. "Harlan Webb told me what Eleanor Briggs said at your gathering, and then I saw my daughter's face." He shook his head slightly, the movement of a man disagreeing with himself. "I've been in this valley 18 years. I know what my children look like when they're not getting enough. This fall should have been the worst for it, and instead—" He stopped. "I've spent 3 weeks trying to find the argument against believing what I can see with my own eyes. I couldn't find one that held." Maeve was quiet for a moment. "What do you want, Mr. Boone?" He shifted in his chair. "I want to learn," he said. The words came out with visible difficulty, like something being moved that was heavier than expected. "What you know, what you've been teaching the children. I want my family to know it properly, not secondhand through the Pruitt boy." He paused again. "And I want to—" He stopped. "Say what you're going to say." He met her eyes directly for the first time since sitting down. "I've been part of the problem," he said. "Not the worst part. I didn't write notes in the dark, and I didn't repeat the Crowell woman's stories at full volume. But I stood at enough fence lines and didn't correct what was being said, and in a tight community that's not a neutral position. It's a choice." He picked up his hat and turned it in his hands. "I'm saying I made the wrong choice, and I know it." She looked at him for a long moment. There was no performance in it, no practiced guilt, none of the elaborate self-flagellation that some people used as a kind of currency for absolution. Just a large man with his hat in his hand saying a thing he'd apparently decided needed saying regardless of what it cost him. "Come to the creek Saturday morning," she said. "Bring your wife. Bring the children if they want to come." He exhaled, not loudly, not dramatically, just the particular exhale of a person who has been holding something for a while and is setting it down. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. The creek is cold in October and the learning takes longer than people expect." She stood up, which he took as the signal it was, and got to his feet. "Also," she said, "I want to ask you something." He paused. "The fence line conversations, the ones where things were being said about me and you weren't correcting them, how many of those men are in the same position you're in right now?" He thought about it, really thought about it, which she appreciated. 6, maybe. The ones with children. Ranchers are practical people underneath the pride. They respond to what they can see. He paused. "What are you asking me to do?" "I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm telling you what I told Gideon 2 months ago. The knowledge spreads faster than I can carry it alone. I can teach your family Saturday. I can't teach the valley." He held her gaze. He was, she realized, a smarter man than she'd given him credit for. He'd been given more credit for other things. Acreage, cattle, the kind of settled authority that came with being established and male and large. And the intelligence had been running quietly underneath all of it. "I'll talk to them," he said. "I can't promise how it lands. Talking is enough to start with." He put on his hat. "Saturday morning," he said. 6 o'clock. We go before the light gets too strong. Some of what I need to show you is easier to identify in morning shadow." He nodded and went out. Gideon appeared from the back room about 30 seconds later, which told her he'd been listening from the doorway. She didn't comment on this. "Silas Boone," he said. "Yes. I've been trying to get Silas Boone to listen to anything for 3 years. You weren't teaching him something his children needed." Gideon leaned against the doorframe. "What did you make of him?" "I think he meant it," she said. "I think he's going to be better at talking to the ranchers than I would be, because they won't have to get past their pride before they listen to him. He's one of them. I'm not." She paused. "I think he's going to be useful." "That's a cold way to put it." "It's an honest way to put it. He's a man who made a choice I didn't like and came to say so, and I respect that. But usefulness is what this valley needs right now. The time for something warmer than useful can come later. Silas Boone came to the creek Saturday at 6 with his wife Margaret and their 3 children, and the expression of a man who had never woken up at dawn for anything except cattle and was reserving judgment about whether this was different. Margaret Boone was a compact, efficient woman who looked at the creek bank and the plants growing along it with the specific assessment of someone cataloging a resource. She asked better questions than her husband on the first morning, which Maeve suspected he'd anticipated and had made peace with. Their oldest, a girl of 12 named Carla, took to it the way certain children did, with an immediate, unself-conscious absorption that suggested she'd been waiting for someone to teach her something that felt real. By the end of the first morning, she could identify 6 plants reliably and had developed her own system for remembering them, involving a small notebook she'd brought without being told to. Maeve watched Carla Boone crouched at the creek bank with her notebook and felt something she didn't immediately name. It wasn't quite pride. Carla wasn't hers to be proud of. It was something quieter, the feeling of seeing something go where it needed to go. The fence line conversations happened, as Silas Boone had said they would. She didn't witness them directly, but she saw their effects in the way the valley's temperature shifted through November. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the cumulative small ways that mattered. Families who had stopped coming to her quietly resumed. Men who'd stood at fence lines saying nothing began asking questions at the supply depot. The kind of questions that only got asked when someone had already made up their mind that the answer mattered. 3 ranchers came to her door in the space of 2 weeks. Not together, separately, alone, each one with his hat in some version of his hands, and a version of the same sentence about having reconsidered. She taught all 3. She sent 2 of them to the creek with Silas Boone, who had become by mid-November something she hadn't planned for him to become, an informal second instructor, not teaching plants, which he was still learning himself, but teaching the ranchers' community how to receive the teaching without their pride getting so badly in the way that nothing could get through. It was Agnes Decker who pointed this out. "He's translating you," Agnes said, "taking what you know and putting it in language the Holts of this valley can hear." "I know. Does it bother you?" Maeve considered the question. "It would bother me if the knowledge didn't move. It doesn't bother me how it moves." She paused. "I spent 3 years being bothered that this valley couldn't see what was in front of it. I don't have the energy to also be bothered about who gets credit for the seeing." Agnes gave her a look that was warm in the economical way that Agnes's warmth tended to operate. "You're a harder woman than you let most people know," she said. "I'm a practical woman. People confuse the two." Tom Holt came to her door in the second week of November, which she had not predicted. Not alone. He brought his wife Sarah, which she also hadn't predicted, and the combination of the 2 of them standing on her porch with the particular stiffness of people who have rehearsed something gave her a moment's warning about what was coming before it arrived. Tom Holt was not a man built for apology. He was built for certainty and forward motion and the kind of confidence that filled rooms, and everything about the speech he'd clearly been working on sat badly in his body, like a tool being used for the wrong job. He got through about 2 sentences of it before the whole structure collapsed, and he just said, flatly, "I was wrong about you. I said things I shouldn't have said, and I stood by while other things got said, and I'm sorry for both." Sarah Holt, beside him, had the expression of a woman who had helped engineer this moment and was watching it with the careful attention of someone who knew exactly how fragile it was. Maeve looked at Tom Holt, at the discomfort in every line of him, the sheer physical effort of standing here saying this. She thought about the morning she'd stood 20 feet off the trail and listened to his wife's voice among the others. The easy laughter, the particular cruelty of people who haven't yet needed to be careful. "Come in," she said. She made coffee. The 4 of them sat at the kitchen table and talked for an hour. Not about the apology, which had been delivered and received and didn't need to be handled again, but about the practical situation. What the Holts had left in their root cellar. What they'd managed to salvage from the season. What they needed to know to get through winter. Tom Holt was not a graceful student. He interrupted questions with adjacent opinions and had the habit of nodding before he'd fully understood something, which she had to work around by checking comprehension indirectly rather than asking directly. But he paid attention in his way, and Sarah Holt, who was quieter and faster, picked up everything and clearly intended to be the one who actually applied it. When they left, Sarah Holt paused at the door and said quietly without her husband hearing, "He's been losing sleep over it, since the doctor's record. I want you to know that." "He came," Maeve said. "That's what matters." Sarah Holt nodded and went after her husband. Gideon, who had absented himself to the back of the property for the duration, reappeared within 5 minutes. "Tom Holt," he said. "Yes." "In our kitchen?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "How was it?" "Hard for him. Easier than he expected, maybe, by the end." She stacked the coffee cups. "He's going to be fine. He's a man who makes up his mind slowly and then won't change it. Now that his mind is made up differently, he'll be one of the more reliable people we've got." Gideon leaned against the counter. "You keep thinking about all of them in terms of what they're going to contribute. Someone has to. Don't you want to just, I don't know, be angry at them for a while?" She thought about it. "I was angry," she said. "I was angry when the notes were coming. I was angry when the family stopped coming to the creek. I was angry for about 3 weeks in October in a way that wasn't useful to anyone, including me." She set the cups in the basin. Being angry at Tom Holt now that he's come to apologize would be like being angry at the rain after the drought breaks. What would be the point? Gideon was quiet for a moment, then, "I love you," he said. He said it simply, without preamble, which was not his typical register. He was usually a man who approached that kind of statement from a considerable distance. "I've not said it enough, and I haven't always shown it in the right ways. I want to say it plainly." She looked at him. He held her gaze without flinching. "I know," she said. And then, because he'd been plain about it and deserved the same, "I love you too." They stood in the kitchen with the October light coming through the window and the empty coffee cups in the basin and the baskets by the door. And it wasn't a smooth moment or a perfect one. There was too much history in the room for that, too many particular silences and distances that had built up over 4 years of two people learning how to be married in the imperfect way that most people were married. But it was real. It was as real as anything she'd found along the creek bank, and considerably harder to come by. Outside, the 1st of November's cold was beginning to move down from the mountains. She could feel it through the window glass. That particular edge, different from October's chill, carrying the specific weight of a season that meant business. She thought about the cattail flower in the storage box, the dried nettles hanging in the shed, the acorn flower she'd finished processing last week, sealed in the earthenware jars Gideon had carried up from the lower supply depot, the mushrooms dried and packed, the violet preserve in its dark jars, the knowledge distributed through 11 children and their families, through Silas Boone's Saturday mornings, through Agnes Decker's patient reinforcement, through the demonstration she'd laid out at the well clearing on that cold October Saturday with Eleanor Briggs eating nettle soup in her good wool coat. It wasn't enough for every worst case. It never was. But it was more than the valley had gone into September with, and it was distributed in a way that multiplied itself. In Carla Boone's notebook, in Eli Pruitt's memory, in the 3 ranchers who now knew the creek bank the way they knew their fence lines. "Come to bed," Gideon said. "In a minute." She stood at the window for another moment, looking out at the valley in the last of the November light. The stripped fields, the bare tree lines, the mountains immovable at the north end, carrying snow on their upper ridges now, the white coming down a little lower each morning. Winter was coming. It was always coming. The only question was whether you'd been paying attention before it arrived. She turned from the window and went to put out the lamp. Winter came to Red Willow Valley the way it always did, without asking permission and ahead of schedule. The first serious snow fell on the 8th of November, 3 weeks earlier than the oldest settlers could remember seeing it come, and it didn't stop at the polite dusting that sometimes opened the season. It came down through the night and through the following day, and when it finally let up on the second morning, there were 14 inches on the flat ground, and the mountains to the north had disappeared entirely behind a wall of white that looked less like weather and more like a decision. Maeve stood at the window in the early dark of that second morning and looked at what the valley had become. The stripped fields were gone under the snow, which was, in its way, a mercy. The ugliness of a failed harvest buried clean. But what the snow also buried was access, and access was what the next 3 months would be decided by. Access to wood, to water, to the settlements farther out, and to the food stores that every family had been calculating and recalculating since September, with the particular arithmetic of people who knew the margin was thin. She pulled on her coat and her boots and went out before Gideon was up. The creek was still running, cold enough to numb a hand in 30 seconds, but running, which meant the watercress at the protected bend near the alders was still accessible under the snow's edge. She'd banked on this. The alder stand broke the wind and held a pocket of slightly warmer air at the south-facing bank, and she'd checked it twice in October when the first cold came, confirming that the watercress was still vital beneath the surface of the water. She broke through a thin skin of ice at the bank's edge and found it there, dark green, cold, alive. It wasn't much. It wasn't a solution. But it was something the valley didn't know it had, and something was where you started. She gathered what she could and carried it back through the snow, her breath making clouds and her boots breaking through the crust with each step. The valley was absolutely silent under the snow. The particular silence of a landscape that has had everything familiar muffled and rearranged so that even sounds you expected were absent. No birds in the lower field, no movement on the road. She was halfway back to the cabin when she saw the light in the Pruitt window. Claire was up early, too. That was something. The first week of the snow was the worst in terms of fear. Not starvation, not yet, not by a long measure, but the fear of it, which in a tight community could do almost as much damage as the real thing. People who had been managing their anxiety with the activity of preparation now had nothing to do but sit inside and count what they had left and imagine February. Maeve moved through it as practically as she knew how. She organized the first of what became weekly distribution rounds. Not charity. She was careful about how she framed it because charity in a proud community was something people had to be talked into accepting, and she didn't have the time or the patience for that particular conversation 40 times over. She called it a cooperative inventory. What do you have? What do we have collectively? What does the collective need to get through the next 2 weeks? And how do we balance it? Gideon helped her run the numbers, which was his gift. He had the kind of mathematical mind that processed scarcity calmly and produced clear outputs, and in this context that was more valuable than anything emotional. Agnes Decker provided the medical dimension. Who in the valley was most vulnerable? Which families had children young enough that nutritional gaps would show up fastest, where the genuine risks were concentrated? She and Maeve cross-referenced lists on Agnes's kitchen table on a Tuesday evening while the snow came down again outside, and the lamp made a small warm circle around them. The Garrett family is more depleted than Elias is letting on, Agnes said. He's a proud man and he won't say so directly, but I've seen the children twice this month, and they're thinner than they should be. I know. I left dried nettles at their fence post twice last week. Maeve looked at the list. He didn't send them back. Which means he's using them. Agnes made a note. The Voss widow is all right. She's been coming to you since October, and she knows more about the creek plants than half the valley now. Sadie Voss is one of my best students. Her children, too. The Crowells. Maeve looked up. Agnes held her gaze. The Crowell household hasn't come to you, and from what I can piece together, their stores are running shorter than Beatrice is admitting. The room was quiet for a moment, except for the sound of the wind against the window glass. How short? Maeve asked. Short enough that the children will feel it by January if nothing changes. Agnes set her pen down. I'm telling you because you need to know the full picture. I'm not telling you what to do about it. Maeve looked at her list. She looked at the numbers Gideon had run. How much was in the collective stores, distributed across what she'd gathered and processed and taught others to gather and process, how long it would carry the valley at current usage rates. The numbers were not comfortable, but they were not catastrophic. There was room, if the room was used carefully. Leave it with me, she said. She thought about Beatrice Crowell for 3 days. She thought about the notes on the mantel, unsigned in pencil. She thought about the high, bright voice on the upper road the morning of her birthday, the easy laughter, the particular architecture of contempt that Beatrice had built around her over 3 years and defended even when the beetles came and the defense stopped making sense. She thought about what Claire had said in early October. I think she's scared of what it means that you were right. On the 4th day, she packed a basket. Dried nettles, cattail flower, a jar of violet preserve, A small cloth of mixed dried mushrooms with a piece of paper on which she'd written preparation instructions in her plain, practical handwriting. She walked to the Crowell cabin in the snow. She knocked. The door opened after a long pause. Beatrice Crowell stood in it, and the sight of Maeve on her doorstep produced an expression on her face that moved through several stages too quickly to fully catalog. Surprise, then something that might have been shame, then the reflexive reassembly of her usual composure, which snapped back into place with the speed of long practice. "Mrs. Callahan," she said. Her voice was careful and level. Maeve held out the basket. "Winter stores," she said. "I have surplus. I'm distributing to families with children." A silence. Beatrice looked at the basket. She looked at Maeve's face, clearly checking for the shape of something, pity or triumph, or the kind of deliberate magnanimity that was really just cruelty in formal dress. Whatever she found or didn't find, she took the basket. "Thank you," she said. It came out flat and slightly strangled, which was probably the best it was going to sound, and Maeve understood that. She nodded and turned to go. "Mrs. Callahan." She stopped. A pause behind her, longer than was comfortable, the kind that had several abandoned sentences in it. Then, "My youngest has been asking about the creek, about the plants." Another pause. "She heard the Pruitt boy talking about it at the well." Maeve turned back around. Beatrice Crowell was standing in her doorway with Maeve's basket in her arms and the expression of a woman who has spent a great deal of energy maintaining a position and has just, privately, decided to stop. It didn't look like relief. It looked like exhaustion, which was probably more honest. "Send her Saturday," Maeve said. 6 o'clock at the Lower Creek. She can come with the Boone children." Beatrice gave a short nod. She was not going to say more than she'd already said, and Maeve didn't need her to. She turned and walked back through the snow. She didn't feel triumphant. She'd been wondering if she had been slightly suspicious of the fact that she wasn't. But when she examined it honestly, what she felt was mostly tired. And underneath the tired, something that wasn't quite forgiveness, but was in that general direction. Not for Beatrice's sake specifically, for her own. Carrying contempt through a hard winter took energy she had better uses for. December moved slowly, the way difficult months did. But it moved. The cooperative distribution became a genuine community practice, formalized enough by mid-December that Elias Garrett, who had finally set his pride down somewhere around the third week of November, in the pragmatic way of men who understood that operations needed management, was helping Gideon run the weekly accounting. This was not a small thing. Elias Garrett was the closest thing the Valley had to an authority, and his involvement transformed the distribution from Maeve's personal project into something that belonged to the community itself. She'd wanted this from the beginning. She hadn't been sure it would happen. She told Gideon one evening, trying to put it into words. "It can't be mine," she said. "If it stays mine, it ends when I'm not here to run it, or it ends when the Valley decides it's had enough of me, which has nearly happened once already. For it to survive, it has to belong to everyone." "It already does," Gideon said. "Carla Boone's notebook, Eli Pruitt's memory. The Garrett children have been mapping plant stands on the south slope. Did Agnes tell you?" She mentioned it. 3 of them, independently, drawing maps they didn't need anyone to tell them to make. He paused. "You taught children. Children don't give knowledge back. It goes in and stays in." She thought about this. About Eli's gap-toothed seriousness at the creek bank in September, asking what to do if she wasn't around. Leave it alone. The Valley isn't going anywhere. There'll be another chance tomorrow. She'd meant it as instruction about plant safety. She wondered now if it had landed as something larger. The children were the part of this she hadn't fully anticipated, not the adults. She'd known the adults would be difficult, had calculated for pride and resistance and the long, complicated process of people revising what they'd decided to believe. She'd planned around that. What she hadn't planned for was the straightforward, uncomplicated way the children had absorbed it, without any of the social scaffolding that made adults slow. Eli Pruitt and Carla Boone and Danny Marsh, Danny Marsh, who had come to the creek for the first time in November with his mother and had turned out to have the same instinct for it that his mother had, the practical engagement of someone who found useful knowledge intrinsically satisfying, and Agnes Decker's granddaughter, who at 9 years old could identify 14 valley plants by name and feature and had started correcting adults who got them wrong, with the magnificent unself-consciousness of children who haven't yet learned to soften their accuracy. These children were going to grow up in this valley. They were going to marry into it and build families in it and face whatever seasons the land decided to send, including bad ones, including catastrophic ones, including the beetle years that came without warning and took everything cultivated down to stripped stalks in a morning. And they were going to know something their parents had spent a crisis learning. They were going to know it the way they knew their own names, not as emergency knowledge, but as ordinary knowledge, as the texture of daily life. That was the thing Maeve hadn't found the words for yet, but was learning toward. The difference between knowledge as crisis response and knowledge as inheritance. What she'd been doing, without planning it in those terms, was trying to turn one into the other. The first child in the valley who didn't get sick that winter was nobody's child specifically, and everybody's child generally. A small victory distributed across 40 families in the form of adequate nutrition and the particular resilience that came with it. Agnes Decker tracked it in her medical records with the quiet satisfaction of a woman whose entire professional life had been an argument for the proposition that prevention was worth more than treatment. 3 winters ago, she told Maeve in January, over the kitchen table with the snow still heavy against the window, I treated 11 children for nutritional-related illness between December and February. Last count this winter, 2, both of them from circumstances that had nothing to do with food. Who? Henderson boy. He had a respiratory issue that was going to come regardless. Little Decker girl, which I feel personally responsible for since that family knows better, and I told them so. Agnes looked at her notes. By every measure I can apply, this valley's children are coming through a hard winter in better shape than they came through the last easy one. Maeve sat with that for a moment. She didn't say anything. Agnes didn't seem to require a response. She'd said it as a fact, the way she said most things, and it settled into the room without needing to be celebrated. But Maeve felt it. In the place where she'd been carrying the weight of it since September, since the morning she'd watched the beetles reach the first corn stalks and understood what was coming and had run, not to stop it, but to do the only thing she actually could. She felt something in that place shift, not dissolve. The worry didn't dissolve, because there was still February and still the long question of spring and what the valley would plant and how it would rebuild the cultivated stores that had been destroyed. But the weight changed character slightly, lightened by an ounce or two. She went home and told Gideon. He listened, nodded, and then went outside and split wood for an hour in the cold, which was his way of processing good news that he didn't have ready words for. She watched him through the window and didn't interrupt. What? The letter came in February, delivered by a writer from Harlan County who was moving the winter mail circuit and arrived looking like he'd had an argument with the weather and barely won. It was addressed to Maeve Callahan Mercer, which still surprised her every time someone used the full name. The return notation said it was from the Regional Agricultural Council at Harlan County, which was a body she'd heard of but never had any contact with. A loose organization of frontier settlers and small farmers from 6 valleys who met twice yearly to share information about growing conditions, pest management, and what they called broadly the science of frontier survival. She read it at the table while Gideon stood at the window, conspicuously not reading over her shoulder. The letter was from a man named Walter Cray, who identified himself as the council's secretary and wrote in the careful, slightly formal language of someone who was not entirely comfortable with paper, but understood its necessity. He had heard, he wrote, from Bernard Alt, who circuited through the council's territory and apparently talked about the settlements he visited with more detail than Maeve had realized. He had heard about what had happened in Red Willow Valley after the beetle year, and about the knowledge-sharing work that had carried the community through its first hard winter since the crop failure. He was writing to ask whether Maeve would be willing to present her methods at the council's spring gathering, scheduled for the end of April in the town of Bridger's Crossing, 2 days' ride east. She put the letter down. Well, Gideon said, still looking at the window, the Regional Agricultural Council wants me to speak at their spring meeting. He turned around. Bernard Alt, he said. Apparently. I told you he meant what he said. She looked at the letter again. Present her methods. She thought about what that meant, practically. What she'd say, how she'd organize it, what the men sitting in that room would expect versus what she'd actually have to tell them. She thought about this fact that she was a woman in her 20s who hadn't been invited to the Valley's canning sessions, being asked to address experienced frontiersmen from 6 valleys about the science of frontier survival. The absurdity of it sat alongside the gravity of it in a way that was almost funny if you looked at it right. "What are you thinking?" Gideon asked. "I'm thinking about what they expect versus what I know," she said. "Those are going to be different things." "How so?" "They'll expect a presentation about plants, lists maybe, species names, preparation methods, something they can write down and distribute." She folded the letter along its original creases. "What I actually have to tell them is harder to write down." "Which is?" She looked at him. "That the plants were never the main thing. The plants are just what's there. The main thing is paying attention long enough to know what's there before you need it." She paused. "You can't learn to forage in a crisis. You have to learn it in an ordinary morning, for years, before the crisis comes. By the time you need it, it has to already be part of how you see the land." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Tell them that," he said. "They might not want to hear it." "Tell them anyway." He said it with the directness she'd been learning over these months was his best quality. The willingness to say plainly what he thought, when he thought it mattered. The ones who need to hear it will hear it. The ones who don't, they'll learn when their own beetle year comes. She looked at her husband in the February light, thin winter light coming flat through the window glass, putting no particular beauty on anything, just illuminating it. He'd aged slightly through this season. Or she was seeing him more clearly, which came to the same thing in terms of what you noticed. "I'll write back," she said. She spent the rest of winter preparing. Not in the way she'd imagined public preparation. She didn't write a formal presentation, didn't organize her thoughts into the kind of structured argument she'd imagined the council would expect. She thought about it differently, the way she thought about teaching. What did the person in front of her actually need to understand, and what was the most direct route from where they were to that understanding? She talked it through with Eleanor Briggs, who had spent more time in her company since October than in the previous 3 years combined and had developed a habit of arriving at Maeve's door on Thursday afternoons with a small jar of something, once preserved plums, twice dried fruit, once a piece of good cheese that she didn't explain the provenance of. They sat at the kitchen table and talked, in the elliptical, unhurried way of 2 people who had reached the point of not needing to justify what they said to each other. "They'll want numbers," Eleanor said. "Councils always want numbers? How many families, how many children, what quantity of food?" "Agnes has those." "Get them from Agnes, put them in the presentation. Give them the numbers first, and they'll be more willing to hear the rest." Eleanor turned her teacup in her hands. "What is the rest exactly, in a sentence?" Maeve thought about it. "That survival on the frontier depends on knowing your land as a system, not just as a field." Eleanor considered this. "That's good," she said. "Say it exactly like that. Don't dress it up. Men who have spent 20 years on the frontier will recognize the truth of it if you say it plain. And if they don't, then they'll learn the hard way, as Gideon says." A pause. "You'll have planted a seed regardless. That's what teaching is. You plant it, and you walk away, and you don't always know what it becomes." Maeve looked at her. Eleanor Briggs was 71 years old and had buried a husband and 2 children in this valley, and had watched 30 years of seasons come through, and had gotten up in the morning after every one of them and kept going in the particular way of people who had decided that keeping going was simply what you did. She had sat at the well clearing in her good wool coat and eaten nettle soup, when doing so was a public act with consequences, and she'd done it without drama or announcement. "Why did you come on Saturday?" Maeve asked. She'd never asked directly. "You could have waited. You could have seen which way it went and come down on the winning side afterward. That would have been easier." Eleanor set her cup down. She thought about the question with the same seriousness she brought to everything. "I've been in this valley for 30 years, she said. "I've watched it be wrong about people before. Not often. Mostly the valley's judgment is reasonable. But sometimes—" She paused. "You were right, and the valley was wrong. And I knew it. And I am too old to spend energy pretending I don't know things I know. That's a young person's game." She looked at Maeve with those sharp, dark eyes. "Also," she said, "the soup was genuinely good. I see no reason to be a martyr about a decent bowl of soup. Maeve laughed. A real laugh. The full kind, the kind that came up without being managed. Eleanor watched it with the slight softening around the eyes that was her version of smiling. "You should do that more," Eleanor said. "You have a good laugh. You keep it in too much. I'll work on it." "See that you do." April came late and grudging, the way spring came to High Valley country. Reluctantly, with relapses, the warm days interrupted by cold snaps that sent everyone back inside reaching for coats they'd optimistically stored. But it came. The snow retreated up the mountain faces. The creek rose with melt and ran fast and cold and clear. The first tentative green appeared along the south-facing banks, watercress and early sorrel pushing up through the last of the mud, which was the land's way of saying, still here, still giving, still waiting to be asked. The valley's children were at the creek on the first warm Saturday of April, in numbers that made Maeve stop and count, 17. 17 children ranging in age from the Boone girl's 12 years to a toddler who couldn't possibly learn anything practical, but whose older sister had apparently refused to come without her. They came with baskets and notebooks, and the Garrett children's hand-drawn maps, and they moved along the bank with the absorbed purposefulness of people doing something that made sense to them. She stood at the bend and watched them and felt the accumulation of the winter in her body. All of it, the notes on the mantel, and the empty creek bank in October, and Ruth Marsh's bowl of soup, and Tom Holt's hat in his hands, and the small weight of Agnes Decker's numbers. 11 sick children 3 winters ago, 2 this winter. And felt it settle into something that didn't have a clean name, but sat in the chest the way the things that matter sat there. Eli Pruitt appeared at her elbow. He'd grown over the winter, a full inch at least, and his gap-toothed seriousness had deepened into something that looked more like genuine authority, the kind that came from actually knowing what you were talking about. "The watercress at the South Bend is better than last year," he said. "I know. The melt brought good silt down. Can we harvest the far bank too, or do you want to leave it?" She looked at him. He was 9 years old, and he was asking the right question. Not can we take it, but should we take it? Which was the question that took most adults years of being taught before they thought to ask. "Leave the far bank," she said. "Let it establish through May. We'll have more in June than we can use." He nodded and went back to his section of the bank. She watched him go and thought about what Gideon had said in January. "You taught children. Children don't give knowledge back. It goes in and stays in." She understood now what he'd meant in a way she hadn't fully at the time. The knowledge was not hers anymore. It hadn't been hers for a while, actually. It was Eli Pruitt's now, and Carla Boone's, and Danny Marsh's, and the Garrett children with their hand-drawn maps. It was Sadie Voss's and Agnes Decker's granddaughters, and, tentatively, carefully, still learning, Beatrice Crowell's daughters, who had been coming to the creek on Saturdays since late November, with a focused quietness that suggested she was making up for lost time. The knowledge had moved the way good things moved when you stopped trying to control the direction, outward and in all directions at once, touching the valley at points she hadn't planned and couldn't have predicted, becoming something larger than any individual person's practice. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the whole thing. She rode to Bridger's Crossing at the end of April with Gideon, 2 days on horseback through the spring mud of the Eastern Trail. They didn't talk much on the ride. Gideon was not a man who needed to fill travel time with conversation, which was one of the things she'd always appreciated about him. They rode companionably, making camp the first night at a creek bend where the willows were just coming into leaf, pale green and tentative, and eating the simple provisions she'd packed with the efficiency of someone who no longer thought twice about what was in the pack. The Regional Agricultural Council met in a livery hall at the edge of Bridger's Crossing that had been swept out and set with benches and smelled powerfully of its primary purpose. There were perhaps 40 men in the room when she and Gideon arrived, ranging from young ranchers in their 20s to men older than Elias Garrett, with the collective sunburned, calloused, weather-assessed look of people who worked outdoors and assessed each other by competence rather than charm. Walter Cray met her at the door. He was a compact man in his 50s with the organized handshake of someone who corresponded with many people and had learned to make quick, accurate impressions. He looked at her. Looked, she was fairly certain, at all of her, including the parts that had drawn mockery in Red Willow Valley. And then he looked at her face and apparently found whatever he was looking for because he said, Dr. Alt spoke very highly of your work. I'm glad you came. I'm not a doctor, she said. No, he said, without any adjustment in his manner. You're something more practical. Come in. She spoke for 40 minutes. She gave them Agnes Decker's numbers first, because Eleanor Briggs was right about councils and numbers. She told them what had happened to Red Willow Valley in August, the beetles, the crop loss, the arithmetic of a community looking at a winter with inadequate stores. She told them what she'd known that the rest of the valley hadn't, and why she'd known it, and how that knowledge had distributed itself through the community in the months that followed. She told them about the children with their baskets and their notebooks and their hand-drawn maps. And then she said the thing she'd said to Gideon in February, the thing that was harder than any species name or preparation method. You cannot learn to know your land in a crisis, she said. The crisis will come. It comes for every settlement in one form or another, and it comes without warning, and it doesn't wait for you to catch up. What I knew in August, I'd been learning for 3 years before August. Every morning at the creek. Every season watching what grew where and in what conditions, and how fast it came back after harvest. You cannot compress that into a response. She paused. What you can do is start teaching it now, in ordinary time, to the people who will need it in extraordinary time. Children especially. Children learn it the way they learn everything useful, by doing it before they understand why. The room was quiet. One of the older men, she didn't know his name, learned it later as Gordon Fitch, who'd ranched the Corbin Creek territory for 30 years, said from the second row, "We lost children in Corbin Creek 3 seasons ago. Bad year. Not beetles, drought, but the same result." "I know," she said. "Dr. Alt told me." He looked at her. "What you're describing, the teaching, the distribution of knowledge, we tried something like it after. Brought in a man from the eastern settlements who knew plants. He came once, gave a talk, left a list of names." A pause. Nobody remembered any of it 6 months later. "Because it was separate from their lives," she said. "One talk from one person is information. Information doesn't stay. Knowledge stays when it's practiced, when it's connected to things people already do, when children inherit it as a normal part of how they see their land." She paused. "The man you brought in, how much time did he spend at your creek, in your valley, with your children?" Fitch was quiet. "He wasn't from there," he said. "He didn't know our creek." "That's the problem," she said. "I knew ours." Another silence. Walter Cray, at the side of the room, was writing in a notebook with the focused speed of someone capturing something they didn't want to lose. A younger man near the back, 20s, the kind of open face that hadn't yet been weathered into caution, said, "Can you write it down? What you taught them?" "Some of it, yes. I'll give you the plant identifications, the preparation methods, the seasonal information for High Valley country. You can have all of that." She looked at him. "But the part that saved my valley wasn't the list. It was 3 years of mornings before anyone thought it mattered. I can't write that down and hand it to you. You have to decide to start." The room sat with that. 40 men, 40 different calculations running behind 40 pairs of eyes. Gordon Fitch said quietly from the second row, "How do you start?" She looked at him. A man who'd lost children to a bad season, who'd tried one approach that hadn't worked, who was sitting in a livery hall in Bridger's Crossing asking a woman in her 20s how you started. "You go to your creek tomorrow morning," she said. "You take a child with you. You find something growing, and you learn its name." She and Gideon rode home through 3 days of warm spring rain that turned the trail to mud and made the horses work for every mile. She didn't mind. She sat in the rain and watched the country go by. The meadows coming green, the creek they crossed twice swollen with melt, the mountains dropping south as they went west until Red Willow Valley's particular configuration of peaks came into view on the third afternoon, familiar as a face. "How do you think it went?" Gideon asked, somewhere in the last hour. She thought about it. "I think some of them will start tomorrow morning," she said. "And some of them will go home and mean to start and not get around to it. And some of them will think I was interesting to listen to and forget about it by summer." She paused. "That's what happens with any true thing you put in front of people. Some of it takes and some of it doesn't." "Does that bother you?" "It would have bothered me more a year ago." She looked at the mountains. "I used to want the whole thing to take. I used to want everyone to understand at once, immediately, with no resistance. I thought that was how you knew something was worth knowing. A pause. It's not how it works. You plant what you can, and you tend what takes, and you trust that even the seeds that don't germinate this season have done something to the soil. Gideon rode in silence for a moment, then, "That's not a bad way to think about most things. I got it from 3 years of watching a creek bank." He made a sound that was his understated version of a laugh. They came into the valley at late afternoon, down the north track that curved along the mountain face before dropping to the floor. The valley spread below them in the spring light. The field still bare but tilled now. Gideon could see it from up here. The dark-turned earth of replanting. The families who had spent March putting back what August had taken. It would take a full season to rebuild the cultivated stores. Everyone understood that, but understanding it and fearing it were different things now, and the difference was real. Along the creek, she could see a small cluster of figures at the south bend. Even from this distance, from this height, she could tell they were children, moving along the bank with the absorbed, unhurried purpose of people doing something that made sense to them. She sat on her horse at the top of the valley track and looked at them for a long moment. There was no version of this story that was clean. Beatrice Crowell had not transformed into a different person. She had settled into a wary distance that was better than what came before but was not friendship and was probably never going to be. Tom Holt was a better ally than an enemy, but remained a man who would take the credit for understanding something before he actually understood it all the way, which was a particular frustration Maeve had decided to manage rather than solve. Roger Marsh remained quiet, as he always had been, but he'd come to the creek twice in March and his questions were good ones, and that was enough. The valley was not fixed. The valley was a collection of imperfect people in a difficult place trying to get through difficult seasons, which was what it had always been and what it would keep being. What had changed was what those people knew, and what the children behind them would know, and what those children would teach. Without thinking of it as teaching, the way you didn't think of breathing as breathing, just did it, to whoever came after. She nudged her horse down the track toward home. The creek ran clear and cold below, the watercress dark at the bends, the sorrel coming in along the south-facing bank, the nettles just beginning to show at the north exposure where the soil stayed moist. Everything the land offered, patient and reliable, and indifferent to whether anyone understood its value or not. The difference was that someone did, and now more than one someone. And next year, more. And the year after that, more still. Eli Pruitt was going to teach his children someday. Carla Boone had already started teaching her younger siblings. Agnes Decker's granddaughter was going to grow up to be, Maeve suspected, the kind of woman who knew more about the land's capacity than anyone gave her credit for. Until a crisis came, and then everyone would suddenly understand what she'd been doing all along. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked, if you were paying attention. The knowledge that looked like eccentricity in calm times looked like salvation in hard ones. The woman wandering the creek at dawn was doing something that mattered. The valley just didn't have the context to see it yet. You worked in the time before the context arrived. You worked in the ordinary mornings, the unremarkable dawns, the seasons when no one was watching and no one was asking and the beetles hadn't come yet. You worked because the land was there and you knew it, and the knowing was worth something regardless of whether anyone agreed. She came down into the valley at sunset, Gideon half a length behind her, and at the bend of the lower track she could see the children clearly now. Eli Pruitt at the creek bank with his basket, Carla Boone beside him with her notebook, the Garrett children with their maps. They were working, unhurried, in the last of the April light. She didn't call to them. They hadn't seen her yet, and she didn't interrupt. She sat on her horse and watched them work in the fading light above the creek that had been there before any of them, and would be there after. And she felt the weight of the winter and the year and the long accumulation of ordinary mornings that had led to this particular one settle into something that she could finally, accurately, call enough. Not perfect, not finished, not the end of anything except this particular hard season, but enough. Unambiguously, honestly, sufficiently enough. She rode home. Behind her the children were still at the creek, and the light was still holding, and the valley was still doing what valleys did, enduring, offering, waiting to see what the people in it would make of what it gave them. Maeve Callahan turned her horse toward the cabin, and the lamp Gideon would light in the window, and the supper she would make from what the land had given, and she did not look back. She didn't need to. She knew what was there.